Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the Mid-Atlantic Council meeting in April in Galloway, New Jersey. This morning and early afternoon, we're also going to be meeting with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission Policy Board. One quick note before we get started. The Mid-Atlantic Council and Marco is set up in the lobby to share their work with the Mid-Atlantic Ocean Data Portal. And during our breaks, I encourage everyone to go out and check everything out that they have. Joe, do you have anything? With that, let's get started this morning with our first agenda item, the recreational measure setting process framework and addendum. As everyone knows, the percent change approach expires at the end of this year. Therefore, final action needs to take place today to allow time to implement the process for setting 2026 measures. And with that, let's get started. We have Chelsea, Tracy, and Julia with both staffs. Whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. So today, Tracy, Julia, and I are going to be presenting on the recreational measure setting process, framework, and addenda for summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish. Okay, now that I have the clicker working here. So we're going to start off with a review of the action, including some background and overview of the management options under consideration, a summary of the public comments, an FMAT and PDT meeting summary and recommendations, advisory panel meeting summary and recommendations, and council staff recommendations. And the objective of today's meeting is for the council and policy board to take final action on the recreational measure setting process. So starting off with the statement of the problem, the Commission and Council have faced many challenges when setting recreational management measures for summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish, including concerns related to the uncertainty and variability in the recreational fishery catch estimates, and the need to frequently change measures based on those data, especially in a direction that is often perceived as contrary to stock status. Additionally, as the chair noted before, the percent change approach, which is the process that we are currently using, sunsets at the end of 2025. And if this action is not passed to adopt a new process for setting recreational management measures, we will revert back to the previous method that sets recreational management measures to achieve but not exceed the recreational harvest limit, or RHL. The goal statement for this action is to consider the appropriate process for setting recreational measures for 2026 and beyond. And as a quick note before diving into the options, none of the options in the document replace rebuilding plan measures. So for example, bluefish is currently under a rebuilding plan, and any measures for bluefish must continue to comply with that rebuilding plan that's outlined in Amendment 2 to the Bluefish FMP. Because it can take up to 2 years for a rebuilding plan to be implemented after a stock is declared overfished, the options in the document can be used as temporary measures in that interim period between when a stock is declared overfished and a rebuilding plan is put in place. And options C through E outline specific circumstances for these situations. Up on the screen here are the 5 options included in the framework addenda, which are options A through E. And then option C and option D both have 2 sub-options for accountability measures. So we're now going to walk through a summary of the public comment on each of the options and a brief overview of each of the options. So the Commission's public comment period for this action lasted from December 2024 through February 2025, and 5 public hearings were held for this action. There were a combination of virtual and hybrid hearings. During that time, the Commission received 228 written comments and 20 public comments were received over those 5 public hearings. And some individuals provided comment both at a public hearing and via written comments. So up on the screen now is a comment summary of all of the comments received on this action. As you can see, a vast majority, 228 comments, were in support of option C, and 219 comments in support of sub-option C2. T are my initials, C2. We also received comments in favor of option A, option D, and option E. But no comments were supporting option B, which is the currently implemented percent change approach. So we're now gonna step through these public comment summaries and the options. So option A is the no action option. For this option, the percent change approach will sunset at the end of 2025, and the previous FMP requirements for the 4 species will be used for setting 2026 measures and beyond, where measures must aim to achieve but not exceed the RHL, and measures are set for 1 year at a time. And after option A, the remainder of the options in the document consider setting management measures for 2 years at a time. So for option A, 3 organizations and 1 commenter at a public hearing were in support of this option. Comments in support of this option noted that the commercial sector is held to the commercial quota, and thus the recreational sector should be held to the RHL because shared stocks require equal treatment. Comments also noted concern that the commercial industry has invested a lot of time, money, and effort in sustainability certifications for some of these fisheries, and recreational overages and overfishing put those certifications in jeopardy. Comments in support of option A noted the SSC report and have concerns that options B through E in the document will lead the SSC to assume the ABC will be exceeded instead of reached in future specification setting cycles, leading to a potential reduction in commercial quota. And then finally, there was concern just regarding continued ACL overages, and comments that were in support of option A recommended further review by the SSC regarding the implications of these overages on the specification setting process. So some comments in support of option A were not entirely opposed to finding a new way to set recreational management measures, but they did not support any of the options outlined in the document. And these commenters supported exploration of different interim or trial processes for setting recreational management measures. So option B is the percent change approach as currently implemented. And as a quick reminder, I think everyone is familiar with this by now, but this approach uses a comparison of the RHL to a confidence interval around an estimate of expected harvest in the upcoming 2 years. This comparison determines which box you fall into in that first column there. And then next, this option looks at biomass compared to the target level, and it has 3 biomass levels, which are low, high, and very high. And the only opportunity for status quo in this option is if harvest is expected to be close to the RHL and the stock's biomass is high, meaning between 100 and 150% of the target. Otherwise, depending on the category, a stock can have anywhere between a flat 10% reduction or liberalization up to a 40% reduction or liberalization. And we did not receive, again, any comments that were in support of this option, so we're just going to move right along to options C and D here. So options C and D are the modified percent change approaches, and they are similar to the currently implemented percent change approach with some changes. They're different in that they add a 4th biomass category, which is called around the target, and that's for stocks that are close to the target level of spawning stock biomass. These approaches also treat overfished stocks separately, defining a process for setting recreational management measures in that interim period between when a stock is declared overfished and a rebuilding plan is implemented. And finally, these options include additional status quo outcomes. So option C is the modified percent change approach using the RHL and harvest. And as previously explained, this approach is the same as the currently implemented percent change approach with those changes that were noted in the previous slide. So here you can see the additional biomass category in the second column, which defines stocks that are between 90 and 110% of the target as in the around the target category. And then you can also see the addition of status quo outcomes for stocks when harvest is expected to be close to the RHL under all biomass levels. Harvest is expected to exceed the RHL and biomass is very high. and harvest is expected to be lower than the RHL and biomass is low. And then you can also see how those overfished stocks are pulled out and treated separately here. And so option D represents the modified percent change approach using the ACT and catch. And this option is identical to option C, except it uses the ACT in place of the RHL and catch in place of harvest. So I'm going to pass it over to Tracy now, who's going to walk through the sub options for option C and D.
Thanks, Chelsea. So the next 3 slides cover the proposed changes to the accountability measures under options C and D. Currently, for bluefish, accountability measures are considered triggered when the most recent single year of recreational catch exceeds the recreational ACL. The other 3 species use a 3-year average. The first proposed change to the accountability measures would allow bluefish to use a 3-year average as well, but only if there have been no transfers between the commercial and recreational sectors in any of those years. If there has been a transfer between commercial and recreational in the most recent 3 years for bluefish, then bluefish would only use a single year of recreational catch like it does now. Suboptions C1 and D1 are the first of 2 suboptions that would impact the accountability measures under options C and D. The red crossed out text on the slide is language that would be taken out of the current accountability measures, and the green bolded text is what the suboption proposes to be added. For this suboption, the target level is changed from 100% to 90% of the target level to align the accountability measures with the proposed biomass categories in options C and D, where the around the target biomass category starts at 90%. Next, focusing on the text in the bottom right corner, the current accountability measures say that adjustments to recreational measures will be made when an accountability measure is triggered and biomass is above the target. However, we could be in a situation where an accountability measure is triggered, but our recreational measure setting approach says a liberalization could be allowed. The intent of changing will to may is to provide more flexibility for situations where status quo instead of liberalizing might be appropriate as an accountability measure. Lastly, for the suboption, there's additional text to say when biomass is above the target that if a liberalization is allowed, then the scale of the liberalization may be reduced to account for the accountability measure. Suboption C2 and D2 would incorporate all of the changes that I described on the previous slide with the additional consideration of if overfishing is occurring. This would only occur under the following situation. First, the stock is not overfished and not under a rebuilding plan. Second, there was an ACL overage triggering an accountability measure, but based on the most recent information, the overage did not result in overfishing. The ACL was exceeded, but overfishing did not occur, so you would not need an accountability measure response in this situation. If overfishing did occur, then you would either have a scaled payback or you'd adjust measures depending on which biomass category you fall into. These changes are similar to the current commercial accountability measures, where when an overage is due all or in part to discards for the commercial sector, a similar outcome is allowed here. So a majority of commenters were in support of option C, as previously mentioned, specifically 6 organizations, 204 form letters, and 5 individual written comments supported option C. Additionally, 13 comments at public hearings were in support of option C. Commenters in favor of option C noted that this option makes notable improvements to the currently implemented percent change approach through the addition of that new biomass category and additional status quo outcomes. Commenters supported the use of additional information besides recreational harvest data in the recreational measure setting process and noted that this option should be more responsive to stock status while also providing increased stability in recreational management. One organization letter and 1 individual comment supported option D, the modified percent change approach using the ACT and catch. These commenters noted that incorporating catch provides a more comprehensive and stable metric through the incorporation of discards rather than relying on the RA. Commenter felt that option D would reduce regulatory instability and increase the predictability of recreational measures. Commenters who were not in favor of option D were concerned with the use of highly uncertain recreational discard data when setting recreational measures. One organization thought that either option C or D could both be viable with one notable change. A reduction should be required when an RHL or ACT overage is expected and a stock has very high biomass, meaning over 150% of the target. As currently written, options C and D allow for status quo measures when an overage is expected if a stock has very high biomass. The organization thought that allowing status quo in this situation suggests that catch limits do not matter for stocks with very high biomass. The organization instead advocates that a reduction should be required no matter what if an overage is expected, even if the stock has very high biomass. Moving on to the accountability measures sub-options, all comments in support of option C were either in favor of sub-option C2 or did not state a preference for either of the accountability measure sub-options. Specifically, 3 organization letters, 204 form letters, and 1 individual comment supported sub-option C2, and 11 comments at the public hearing supported sub-option C2. 1 individual comment that had supported option D also supported sub-option D2. Those in support of sub-options C2 and D2 noted aligning the accountability measures with the biomass categories in the options and incorporating fishing mortality into the accountability measures would be an improvement. Commenters thought that the fishing mortality metric was important because it represents the best scientific information available and is updated through stock assessments every 2 years. While a majority of commenters were in favor of sub-options C2 and D2, there were several commenters and organizations that were strongly opposed to these sub-options. These commenters were concerned that the sub-options would make accountability measures for the recreational sector optional and or effectively eliminate them. The commenters also expressed concern that these sub-options could allow overfishing to continue unchecked for stocks with higher biomass, and noted the requirement for accountability measures to prevent ACLs, including sector ACLs, from being exceeded, and to correct or mitigate overages of the ACL when they occur. So moving on to option E, the biomass and fishing mortality matrix approach. This approach would consider biomass compared to the target level and whether overfishing was occurring when determining if and how measures should change. Unlike the other options that we described thus far, it does not start with a consideration of expected harvest or catch under the current measures. We received very few comments in support of this option. Therefore, in the interest of time, I'm not going to walk through it in detail, but can address any questions you may have related to it if needed. One individual comment was in support of option E. The commenters noted that this approach relies on the best scientific information available from the stock assessments, which incorporate multiple data streams and do not just rely on the MRIP data. This commenter also noted that this option is likely less sensitive to the variability and uncertainty inherent in the MRIP data compared to all the other options. Several commenters were opposed to option E as currently written due to the complexity of the approach and frustration that liberalizations are capped at 10%. Finally, there were a number of comments received that did not express support or opposition to any of the options, but commented on other aspects of recreational management. First, a large number of comments supported incorporating a revisit provision to the recreational measure setting process. This revisit provision would not be a sunset, but a requirement for the Council and Policy Board to review the selected approach every 5 years to evaluate its effectiveness in providing stability to recreational measures while ensuring measures align with stock status. Next, there was concern from some commenters that this action was very complex and should have been pursued through an amendment rather than a framework addenda. And like with the harvest control rule, there was a general frustration with the complexity of the options. People wanted to know what the measures would be, and there was also concern with the high uncertainty of the current recreational harvest and discard data used in management decisions, and support for the council and commission supporting efforts to improve recreational data. Finally, there was dissatisfaction expressed with the current black sea bass management and a belief that measures are contrary to stock status. So with that, I'm now going to hand the presentation over to Julia.
Thanks, Tracy. Next, I'm going to cover the FMAT and PDT meeting summary. So the FMAT and PDT met on March 10th. They reviewed the public comment summary that you just heard. They also reviewed some additional analysis that provided more information related to catch-based targets. This included an analysis using the recreation demand model and a separate analysis looking at the 10, 20, and 40% thresholds under option D. These analyses were carried out by Science Center staff and council staff. Both analyses were first presented during this FMAT and PDT meeting on March 10th, and they were also discussed during the AP meeting on March 13th. The results were not available during the public comment period. These analyses were carried out in response to concerns that were raised during the public comments about uncertainty regarding harvest versus catch-based targets. And the results of the analysis do not say we need to choose one option over another. They're just intended to provide some additional information to help make the decision. In the interest of time, I'm not going to describe either analysis in great detail, but you can find a lot more information in the briefing materials. So after considering all that information, the FMAT and PDT recommended option D, which is the modified percent change approach that uses the catch-based target. The primary rationale for their recommendation is that option D allows for a more comprehensive consideration of the impacts of the recreational measures on the stock. This is because option D requires us to consider the impacts of measures on both harvest and discards, compared to under the current process and option C, for example, we are only required to consider the impacts of measures on harvest, but not discards. The FMAT and PDT also discussed the 10, 20, and 40% thresholds in light of some of the updated analysis. And long story short on that is that they supported option D as written, including maintaining those 10, 20, and 40% thresholds. The FMAT and PDT also supported option D because they thought it was preferable to use the annual catch target or the ACT to define the target for setting measures rather than the RHL, as is the case under the current process, and option C. So wanted to walk through what they meant by this in a little more detail, because I know it's a little bit hard to wrap your head around if you haven't had much time to think about it. But so this flowchart shows how we derive the ACT and the RHL. So the ACT does not require us to make an assumption about discards prior to setting the bag size and season limits, whereas the RHL is set equal to the ACT minus expected discards. So we need to make an assumption about discards when we set the RHL, and we set the RHL before we set the measures. However, the actual discards will vary based on the measures. So if the measures change, then your assumption about discards that you use for setting the RHL may not be accurate after the measures are set. But we can't go back and revise the RHL after the measures are set because we need the RHL to determine the measures. So this sort of disconnect, or the potential for a disconnect, is not an issue when we use the ACT to set measures as under option D, because the ACT does not require us to make an assumption about what the discards will be prior to setting the measures. We also asked the FMAT and PDT to weigh in on the accountability measure sub-options. So given that they recommended option D, the accountability measure sub-options are D1 and D2. They didn't have a lot to say about that. Only 2 FMAT and PDT members spoke to either option, with one of those 2 speaking in support of option D2, saying that it better aligns with the process used to set measures under option D, So for example, there's some circumstances in which option D allows measures to remain unchanged when biomass is very high, but an ACT overage is expected. And this FMAT and PDT member thought that the rationale behind the changes under suboption D2 better aligned with that intent of if biomass is very high and overfishing is not occurring, then you can leave your measures unchanged. And that suboption D2 might kind of create a disconnect with that by requiring measures to change in more of those circumstances. Another FMAT and PDT member said the choice between suboptions D1 and D2 could be a policy choice because this individual didn't think there was a strong technical justification for one or the other, and it could be left to the Council and Policy Board to decide. The FMAT and PDT also supported the recommendation from some public comments to review whatever process is implemented every 5 years. So they noted that, using the current percent change approach since 2023, along the way, we realized that there are some improvements that could be made, which are considered through this action. And they agreed that if we make more changes as we actually use the revised process, we might realize that there are some other potential improvements that could be made. So this could be considered down the road through a review after implementing a new process for a few specification cycle. But they were strongly opposed to using another sunset period as we currently have in place for the current percent change approach, because that limits the amount of analysis that can be done, and it kind of forces another management action to happen. But a review could take place without necessarily requiring a new management action, but a decision could be made after considering the results of the review if a new action is needed. So then we took all that information to the advisory panel. They met on March 13th. These next few slides summarize comments that were made during the advisory panel meeting, and then a few advisors followed up after the meeting with additional email comments, which are included in an appendix to the meeting summary. But we combined those two types of comments during the meeting and the emails in these next few slides. So multiple advisors expressed frustration with the timing of the new analysis that was first presented during the FMAT and PDT meeting and was also summarized during this AP meeting. They, reiterated that it was released after the public comment period, so we can't predict how the public comments would have been different if this new analysis had been available during the public comment period. Some advisors said that the analysis is too limited to make any conclusions. So for example, the new analysis that used the recreation demand model, it did not include black sea bass or consider years besides 2024. The reasons for that are explained in the briefing materials, but some advisors thought that this was a problematic limitation of the analysis. And some of the information that was presented during the FMAT and PDT meeting and the AP meeting provided more information on statistical uncertainty in the harvest and discard estimates. So some advisors said, even after considering that information, they didn't think that information sufficiently addressed their concerns about recall bias in the discard estimates. So in terms of the specific options that advisors spoke in favor of option A, which is the no action option, which would have us going back to setting measures based on the RHL. So advisors said things like they have concerns about the inaccuracy of the recreational data, the potential for the commercial sector to be penalized for recreational overages, frustration that the recreational sector is not held to the same standards as the commercial sector. And one advisor said we should wait on the results of the recreational sector separation amendment before making changes to the process for setting recreational measures. 8 advisors spoke in favor of option C, which is the modified percent change approach that keeps the harvest target rather than using a catch target. The primary rationale that advisors said for this is that the majority of public comments support this option. 5 advisors spoke in favor of option D, which is the modified percent approach with the catch-based target. These advisors said things like it's important to consider discards when setting the recreational measures. 2 advisors spoke against option D, again, reiterating concern with uncertainty and the recreational discard estimates. And multiple advisors said they did not believe there was enough analysis to support option D over option C. 3 advisors spoke in favor of the accountability measure sub-options, which would give greater consideration to overfishing. So that's sub-option C2 and D2. 1 advisor spoke in favor of option E, which is the biomass and fishing mortality matrix. And this advisor said no restrictions should be applied to healthy stocks. Some other comments provided by advisors. 2 advisors expressed support for the idea of reviewing whatever process is implemented every 5 years. 1 advisor noted that management uncertainty buffers have not previously been applied for these species. So that relates to how we define the ACT and also the RHL. 1 advisor noted concern with the timing of this action and the ongoing efforts to improve the MREP fishing effort survey. 1 advisor said the priority of management should be to rebuild the stocks, and this advisor expressed continued concern with the stock status of summer flounder. Another advisor expressed frustration with the recreational measures that lead to more targeting of large female fish. 1 advisor expressed concern with the survey that's used to inform the angler behavior component of the recreation demand model. And 1 advisor expressed concern for option B through E's reliance on stock assessments every 2 years, noting that we're not necessarily guaranteed to have that frequency into the future, especially with cuts to federal agencies that could put a strain on the ability to keep doing that. 1 member of the public who's on other advisory panels, but not this advisory panel, spoke during this meeting and expressed concern with all of the options, saying they did not believe any would prevent overfishing. Next, I'm going to cover the council staff recommendation, which takes into consideration everything that was just presented. And the council staff recommendation is for option D, which is the modified percent change approach with the catch-based target. This is the same recommendation as the FMAT and PDT. And again, the primary rationale for this option is that it more comprehensively considers the impacts of measures because it requires consideration of how measures impact both harvest and dead discards as opposed to focusing just on harvest. Obviously, discards are an important component of total removals and therefore impacts to the stock, and they're an important aspect of the angling experience. And considering discards when setting the recreational measures would better align this part of the process with other aspects of management. So for example, discards are part of the stock assessment. They're part of what triggers accountability measures. So it'd make more sense to more explicitly consider them when we set the recreational measures. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the comments that expressed concerns that by giving greater consideration to discards, option D would introduce more uncertainty into the management process. I wanted to make it clear that this is not true, given how the data are used to inform the targets and to set the measures. This information was presented to the FMAT and PDT and the AP, but I wanted to reiterate it as part of the council staff recommendation. So this slide shows an illustration of what goes into and what comes out of the recreation demand model. This model was first used to inform the setting of 2023 measures for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. We've continued to use it since that time, and it is established as the best available science for that purpose. So we assume that this model will be used going forward for those species. So nothing about this model needs to change under any of the options in the framework and addenda, and the model already provides all the information we need for all of the options. The model will not use different information under any of the options. So that what you see on the screen here is what the model is going to do under all of the options. So as you can see in pink, the model incorporates observed MREP harvest, reported MREP harvest, and the MREP discard estimates. And the discard information, the MREP B2s, is all self-reported by anglers. So that's a big part of where the concerns come in about the recall bias. But that information is all combined to calculate catch per trip. And you need all that information to predict how both harvest and discards may change under different measures. Even if you're only trying to achieve a certain level of harvest, you still need to know about recent discards to help you think about how harvest would change under different measures. So given that the model is going to be operating this exact same way under all of the options, the issue of recall bias in terms of those MREP B2s, that's baked into the model under all of the options, regardless of which one you choose. And the degree of recall bias in the predictions does not vary across options because the configuration of the model doesn't vary. And I want to just state that recall bias is not a flaw in the model, and the model accounts for uncertainty in all of the input data. So the key difference between option C and D, for example, is how we would use the outputs on the right-hand side there. So under option C, we would only be required to consider the predicted harvest, but under option D, we would be required to consider both predicted harvest and predicted discards. But under all options, the model will still produce all of these estimates. It's just a difference in what we're required to consider or not. So another part of the council staff recommendation relates to considering how measures would change under either option. So it's important to keep in mind that both options C and D allow for more status quo outcomes than the current process. However, when changes are needed, option D could require more drastic changes in measures than option C, and that's important to think about. The reason for this is not because of uncertainty in the discard estimates, it's because most of the discarded fish survive. And I will walk through a theoretical example of why that is on the next few slides. But I just wanted to state up front that this conclusion is not dependent on the species or the years of the analysis. And that's why I'm choosing to illustrate it with this theoretical example that's not based on a modeling exercise. And this example was included in 2 different places in the briefing materials in the form of a table, but it's just reformatted as more of an illustration here. So if we take this baseline example of if under status quo measures, you assume that an angler will keep 2 fish and discard 2 fish, then if you assume that there's a 10% discard mortality rate, which is the discard mortality rate for summer flounder, then the bright blue here represents the amount of that catch that's assumed to be from dead discards. Therefore, under this example, your baseline dead catch is 2.2 fish, which is 2 harvested fish plus 0.2 for the dead discards. So let's just say, for example, if you change your measures to make them more restrictive, and under these new restrictive measures, the same trip is now expected to keep only 1 fish and discard 3 fish. This decreases the harvest by 50% compared to the baseline, but it decreases the dead catch by 41% compared to the baseline. This is just based on the 10% discard mortality rate applied to 3 discarded fish. So 50% is not the same as 41%. So if you needed to change your measures to achieve a 50% reduction in dead catch, you would need to make them even more restrictive than you would if you only need to achieve a 50% decrease in harvest. Another example is if you liberalize measures such that the same trip is now expected to keep 3 fish and discard 1 fish. You can see that that increases harvest by 50% compared to the baseline, and it increases dead catch by 40% compared to the baseline. So the same conclusion is there, that if you wanted to increase your dead catch by 50%, your measures could be even more liberal than if you were only trying to achieve a 50% increase in harvest. So to put it another way, to achieve the same percent change in expected harvest versus dead catch, whether it's so if it's a reduction, your bag size and season limits would need to be even more restrictive under a catch-based target than a harvest-based target when a restriction is needed. But measures could be even more liberal under a catch-based target when a liberalization is needed. This means that option D could require bigger changes in measures than option C when changes are needed. And this is an important trade-off to consider, as stability in measures is a goal of the Recreational Reform Initiative. So in summary, there are pros and cons to both options C and D, and these should all be considered when deciding on the preferred option. So the council staff recommendation is that, given the balance of all of these things, council staff think it's most important to consider the full, or a more comprehensive look at measures in terms of how they impact the stock by considering discards. But again, there's pros and cons to both options that should be considered. Next, for the accountability measure sub-options, the council staff recommendation is for sub-option D2, which is the one that gives greater consideration to if overfishing occurred or not. This is the same as what was shown on the previous slide, but without, with the track changes accepted, basically. So since that was covered pretty well in previous slides, I'm not going to go into the details of that. But I also wanted to reiterate that sub-option D2 provides virtually the same level of conservation as the current accountability measures when stocks are overfished in a rebuilding plan or overfishing. So depending on the stock status, that would either require a pound for pound payback of overages, a scaled payback, or consideration of changes to measures. And that is virtually the same as the current process. And the biggest change is that an accountability measure would not be required when ACL overages did not contribute to overfishing and the stock is not overfished or under a rebuilding plan. So it's useful to think about how this accountability measure sub-option would interact with the process for setting measures under option D. And this is just one example to help you think about it. So in the highlighting on the table here, this is just part of the percent change approach table saying if, for example, an accountability measure was triggered based on recent ACL overages, and if you left measures unchanged, you would expect to have an ACT overage, but your biomass is very high, then the percent change approach says you can leave measures unchanged. Next, you need to think about how the accountability measures play into that. And the accountability measures under sub-option D2 would require consideration of if overfishing was occurring based on the most recent information. And if it was, then you would need to change your measures because of that accountability measure. The accountability measure language that says measures may be adjusted would not be relevant because you expect an overage in this situation. So you're not otherwise allowing a liberalization. So you would have to change measures if an accountability measure was triggered and overfishing was occurring. However, if overfishing was not occurring, you could leave measures unchanged until any of these circumstances changed. So if continued overages eventually lead to overfishing, then the AMs would require a change. If continued overages result in biomass falling below 150% of the target, you can see on the table here that the percent change approach would then require restrictions and measures. It's also important to think about how the language in the draft addenda says that under all options, the board and the council may choose to implement more restrictive measures than would otherwise be required to address management uncertainty or concerns about the long-term sustainability of the stock. So this language allows the flexibility to consider the specific circumstances and determine if more caution is warranted. Next, council staff recommend a delayed effective date to any changes to the process for bluefish. So the specific recommendation is to just wait one more specification cycle before making any changes for bluefish, such that the changes would be effective starting with the 2028 measures. And in the interim specification cycle, bluefish measures would be set based on the no action option, which would include continued adherence to the rebuilding plan if that's still applicable after we get the assessment update in June. And otherwise measures would be set, based on the RHL for bluefish just until 2028, and then we would move to whatever the new process is selected. The rationale for this is that it would allow more time to develop methods for predicting the impacts of bluefish measures on harvest and discards. So for the other species, we have the recreation demand model ready to go, and we would expect to continue to use that. So we don't need a delayed effective date for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. But for bluefish, the methods for modifying your measures can be changed by the monitoring and technical committee each specification cycle, but there's not as well established of like a go-to method for bluefish. So this would allow more time to think about that method so that once the changes are implemented for bluefish, that we feel more prepared that we have a method in place ready to go. Council staff also support the idea of reviewing whatever process is implemented after 5 years. And again, this should not be done with a sunset period. And the council and the board can consider initiating a new management action to make further changes after considering the results of the review, but that wouldn't require a management action until after the council and policy board decide if a new action is needed. Seems waiting for the slide. Okay, this is just a summary of all the parts of the council staff recommendation. Option D, sub-option D2, delayed effective date for bluefish, and review whatever changes are implemented 5 years after implementation. So lastly, hope you're all still hanging in there for this very long presentation. We got 2 late breaking comments last week that just added on to the end of the presentation here. So we got one letter from the New Jersey Marine Fisheries Council that expressed support for option C because it improves upon the current process. This letter opposed option D because, in their words, no trials have been conducted to determine how this option performed. The letter opposed option E because of the conservative management choices. And we got another letter from the American Sport Fishing Association that expressed support for option C, noting that option D would require a greater magnitude of changes and measures, which would result in less stability in measures compared to option C, which this letter said was contrary to the Recreational Reform Initiative goals. This letter also said that the assumptions about discards under option C do not mean that discards are disregarded. And the current process for accounting for discards and using the RHL has had positive biological outcomes and was upheld through a legal action in 2024. And that we can reassess the issue of catch versus harvest-based targets in the future after more analysis. All right, so we made it to the end. Just as a reminder, the decision points are today are to take final action, select from the range of options for final action, consider if you want to have a delayed effective date for bluefish, and consider something like a review 5 years after implementation. And that's all we had, and we're happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, Tracy, and Chelsea. Any questions from council or commission?
Yes, thank you, all 3 of you. But Julie, I know you were trying to get through that as quickly as possible. I should have given you a little more time. But can you just give us a little more rationale behind why 5 years for the review period?
I think the rationale was that it would allow us to go through a few specification cycles. So we have measures set for 2 years at a time now. So 5 years would allow for 2 full specification cycles. And then we could think about any lessons learned from that and then have that be part of the review.
Nicola?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question about our definition of recreational measures. So in this addendum, we define recreational measures as bag size and season as the tools that we can use to achieve a % reduction or liberalization, generally thinking about harvest. Under the catch-based approach of option D, would that definition of recreational measures be expanded to include measures aimed at reducing the release mortality rate, or the number of releases, such as gear restrictions or no target closures? Said another way, under option D, could measures to reduce the discard mortality rate or effort be used to achieve a % reduction in overall removals?
Hi, Nicola. Thanks for the question. I think we haven't had those discussions at the FMAT and PDT level, so that is maybe a little bit unclear at this time. I don't know, Bob or Tony, if they have any clarity on if that would, we're getting a no, a head shake no, it would not include.
And I would like to add that I, at least at this moment, do not believe or I'm not sure if the recreation demand model would be able to determine the impact of those changes on catch.
Mike Penn?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question, Nicola, and very interesting concept. But yeah, as we just heard, I think it would require a future evolution of the RDM to explicitly look at those types of outcomes.
Michelle Duval?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess, we saw a few comments on the change from will to may in, I think, both options, C1, C2, D1, D2 under the accountability measures. And, there's a footnote stating that the intent of that change is to allow for status quo measures when they might otherwise be liberalized. And is there a way to incorporate that footnoted language into, the language of those alternatives? I think, it's giving some folks pause is that and I think you saw this in some of the public comments that were received, is that it makes it sound as though, as though liberalization would be the end result of that, potentially be the end result of that application of the accountability measure. And so I think, being able to pull some of that language into, that was included in the footnote into the actual language of the alternative itself might be, might give some folks a little bit more comfort around the table. So I guess that's my first question.
I think from the council staff perspective, definitely we could do that and it could be clarified in the regulations. And I guess the accountability measures are technically more of a council thing anyway. So I would say yes. I don't know if commission staff have anything to add from their perspective.
Yeah, I think from the commission perspective, it is in the footnote of the addendum. I'd have to see if we could get it moved up. I don't know if we can or not, but the AMs are not a commission process. So I think it may be, if the council can do it, that may help with your question there.
Thanks for that response. And then I guess, the other thing also had to do with some of the comments that I saw in letters where that referenced, I think, like a string of overages under this approach that we're using right now. And I guess I just wanted confirmation from staff that 2023 was the first year that the percent change approach was used to set measures. So we've had only 1 year of catch accounting under the percent change approach. We have set measures using this approach for 2024 and 2025, but obviously, we haven't had 2024 catch accounting just yet. So I think confirmation of that, a yes, that we've only had 1 year of catch accounting under the percent change approach would be helpful, because I think the string of, previous overages that are being referenced occurred under our old process of setting measures. Correct?
Yes,
No.
that's correct. 2023 was the first year the percent change approach was used.
Thank you.
Chris Batsavage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the staff recommendation of delayed implementation for Bluefish, since the RDM is still being developed for Bluefish, what would happen if just we can't get the RDM to provide the credible results or results that can be used for management? Would we have to kind of revisit this again to remove Bluefish, or would we be able to address it some other way if it looked like 5 years later we just weren't going to have an RDM model for Bluefish, and therefore manage it under the rec setting measures addendum?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I did not make the staff recommendation, but I can make general comments on Bluefish. So right now there is no RDM in the works for Bluefish. That's not currently being developed. There isn't a model that's being developed for Bluefish. And Julia can speak more to the recommendation, but I think that delayed implementation period was so that the Council and Policy Board and the Monitoring and Technical Committee for Bluefish could have that buffer period to develop a model, whether it's the RDM or the RFDM or something that hasn't been thought about yet, and get that implemented in time for the following specification setting cycle. And Julia, I don't know if you have anything to add.
just to reiterate that none of the options require us to use the RDM or require us to use any specific method. They would say like, this is the table that you need to walk through, but the details of like how you define the confidence interval and what method you use to set your measures to achieve whatever your target is, those specific methods for stepping through the table can vary through each specification cycle. So we expect the RDM to continue to be used for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. But for bluefish, the monitoring and technical committee can decide whatever method they think is most appropriate. So there could be, hopefully some efforts over the next 2 years to try and get a robust method, whatever it ends up being, that they feel confident in. But we can always fall back on just analyzing the MREP data as we used to do in the past. Like that's not ideal and has some limitations, but you could still like look at a time series of MREP data and use that to define your confidence interval and to tweak your measures. So not having a new model for bluefish wouldn't hold us back from eventually using whatever, option is chosen. It's just the idea of having a delay of 2 years would give more time to see if the monitoring and technical committees could come up with a good method for bluefish.
Jeff Kayla?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, so a minute ago, the staff put up a slide that described the New Jersey Marine Fisheries Council's decision to go with option C from last month. I'm a member of the New Jersey Marine Fisheries Council, and I'm here today supporting D. We were told at that time that the rec demand model wasn't ready to predict discards. We now know that it is. And it is unfortunate that we didn't have that information before we went out to public hearing, for sure. But I just wanted to clarify that as a member of the Marine Fisheries Council, I'm not supporting C today, I'm supporting D. And I wanted to make that clear if anybody was curious when I speak later. Thank you.
Eric Reed?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. So my question is about the national standards. This is a commercial fishery as well, and the difference between the AMs for the commercial fishery and the AMs for the recreational fishery are quite a bit different. Sometimes you don't have to even consider them. So how do any of these options satisfy national standard 4 and maybe 6 and probably 8?
I was pausing to see if Garfo wanted to take that, but I'll give it a try. So for me, it's helpful to think about how the current percent change approach was subject to a lawsuit, that the conclusion was that it did uphold the currently implemented percent change approach, and some of the rationale, which I think still applies, is things like the ACL overages for the recreational fishery do still trigger accountability measures. Even under the proposed revisions to the accountability measures, when overfishing occurred, when the stock is overfished or under rebuilding plan, there's still requirements for changing your measures due to the AM or having a payback. It's only when the stock is not overfished, not under rebuilding plan, overfishing did not occur, that there's the potential for measures to remain unchanged. So the conclusion of the lawsuit said that the way that the accountability measures work, get at the allocation issue, because the ACL overages can still trigger accountability measures. Obviously, there's a lot of differences in the commercial and recreational sectors in terms of the timeliness and the control of the fisheries, the number of participants, the data that we get, and things like that. So this action is intending to balance things like preventing overfishing with achieving optimum yield. I think I saw Mike Pentney move a little bit. I wasn't sure if you were going to add something or if I can stop there. I would just say things like that. But when the council submits, the framework, we do have to really lay out all those considerations and justify them before the framework can be approved.
Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I mean, we manage the two fisheries differently. And so we have, different approaches to accountability measures, but the commercial fishery on the commercial side, we have these contingent AMs already for the commercial fleet as well. Looking at the regulations, if the biomass is above BMSY, then no single year accountability payback is required for on the commercial side. If the biomass is above the threshold but below the target and the stock is not under a rebuilding program, then whether there's a commercial AM, a payback, depends, and it scales. So the only time that the commercial fleet is obligated to have a payback is if the stock is overfished or it's under a rebuilding plan. And we treat overages due to discards differently than overages due to landings for the commercial fleet. So I think, when we're trying to compare accountability measures, it's hard to compare directly, but we already do build for the commercial fleet, build into these different considerations and contingencies. So it's not a stretch to look at building similar contingencies and different approaches for the recreational fleet as well.
Jim Gilmore.
Thanks, Chairman. Just a quick note. And for Eric's point, looking at it from just an objective thing, I think option D makes the most sense. And you start getting into the national standards. Trust me, every time you get into this, there's lots of contradiction to the national standards. But the one that I came back to and why I'm supporting option C is because National Standard 2 says we have to use the best available data, and we just don't have a lot of data to start going into option D. I think we're going to get there, but at this point in time, we just aren't there. So I don't know if the national standards are sequential, but we don't get past 2 to get to the other ones yet. So at this point, I think option C is a better, alternative at this point, just because we need to get more data before we start going into a harvest-based assessment. So, thank you.
Mike, you have a response?
Yeah, well, not really a response, but just to ask the staff to maybe restate what I thought I heard them say, which is that the same data are used regardless of whether we're talking about alternative D or alternative C. And the model is already built to support alternative D. Is that correct?
Yeah, I just pulled up this slide again, that this configuration of the model is the same under C and D, and that the same information is going in and coming out under both C and D. So the discard data is still going into the model either way, and it's still predicting discards either way under both C and D.
Mike Luisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for the presentation. I hope this question makes sense, and I'm not sure. Maybe it's Julia that I'm asking the question of, since in Appendix 2 of your memo, the tables under Table 6 look at both black sea bass and summer flounder MRIP units, discards assumed when setting the RHL, final discards, and then the difference. And when you look at those tables, there's a definite trend in that black sea bass final discards are typically much higher than what we assumed going in. And for summer flounder, we are underestimated. The final discards are much less than over the past handful of years. And so what I'm trying to understand from a manager's perspective, those trends, always overestimating or always underestimating, in my opinion, is when you see that you're doing that, you should take some type of effort to try to minimize that difference from what you're estimating to what actually happens. Some type of approach to try to minimize that difference is something that I think we would take pretty seriously. And I'm trying to understand functionally, how option C and option D differ in our approach to, to make our predictions more closely aligned with reality, and which one does that better. You know, in reading through the documents and the materials, right now I see option D as being something that I like in concept. I like the idea of, and I know I'm getting into comment and I'm going to stop in a second, but I'm trying to understand where that difference lies in not only what we do next year, but if this is going to be something that is carrying out for 4, 5, 6 years before any type of review. I want to make sure that under this reform initiative that we're, you know, reform to me, there's a definition that we should be enhancing, improving, and bettering what it is that we currently have. And I can't figure that out on my own, and I need a little help. So if you can kind of give me some direction as to which one does a better job of getting us closer to reality and on an annual or every other year basis, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Sure. So to this specific point, this table on the screen shows what was in the appendix that you referenced for black sea bass. So it's showing the level of discards that we assumed when we set the RHL compared to what the final discards were. And then the difference, the red highlighting is for every time that the final discards were higher than what we assumed when setting the RHL. So you can see that occurred every year on the table here. And 2012 is the first year that we had the implementation of the ACLs and ACTs. So this is the entire time series of having the ACTs in place through 2023, because we don't have final 2024 data yet. But you can see every year except for one, the final discards were higher than what we assumed. And then the last column was the ACL exceeded? And all of those yeses match up with all the reds for the difference column. So that means that in every year except for one, we had higher discards than what we assumed when setting the RHL, and that contributed to ACL overages. The flip side is the summer flounder had the opposite pattern, which you noted, where discards were very consistently lower than what we predicted when we set the RHL. And that, you know, mostly the ACL was not exceeded. And there's 2 cases where it was that was due to harvest, but not discards. So these are just examples of how the current process for how we assume discards when we set the RHL are not matching with reality. And we could do a better job of predicting discards for this part of the process. Again, this is another instance of where the methods of how we predict these discards is not set in stone. It can be modified each specification cycle. So it is worth thinking about this and trying to improve this in the future. Where it is relevant in terms of option C versus option D is that under option D, this wouldn't even be relevant when you set measures, because what's shown on the screen here is how you get from the ACT to the RHL. And under option D, you would be setting measures based on the ACT. So that's before you even get to the RHL. So you wouldn't need to make an assumption about discards that would violate what might occur when you set your measure. So just by kind of focusing one step up higher in the flow chart, you kind of get around this issue altogether. If we stick with option C and use the RHL, we could try and improve these numbers and get it, you know, closer to reality. But even still, we would have the issue of needing to make this assumption before the discards or before the measures are set.
Thank you, Julia, for that. And just a quick follow-up, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the follow-up. So the difference, as I hear it, is that if we select option C moving forward, we are going to continue to use a similar approach, coming up with what we believe to be, and maybe an average or over a period of time, what a reasonable assumed discard would be. Set our measures based on that to the RHL because we've assumed those discards. So we're making the assumption on the discards, or we have the model predict the discards and we use that in moving forward. So those are the 2 main pieces functionally how it would be different.
Yes, that's accurate.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Mike Penny.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that question with another question, which I want to make sure that I'm thinking about this correctly, because I have a slightly different interpretation of C versus D. But I think we're getting there. So under option C, as you just said, Julia, and as Mike restated, at the outset, we make an assumption about what discards are going to be. And then based on what's left, we feed input to the model and we get a set of potential changes to bag season and size. I think we all know that changes to bag season and size have differential potential impacts on what discards might be, right? A significant increase in the minimum size, you're going to drive discards up. A significant decrease in minimum size presumably would drive some discards down because you're converting those to catch, to landings. But under C, we're ignoring all of that. We're saying we're taking an assumption about discards at the start, and then we're going to make decisions about measures. If I'm understanding things correctly, the power of alternative D in using the model is we start with the total catch, ACT, and then we say, what combination of bag season and size achieves that, incorporating discards, so that if we could liberalize, then an increase in or a decrease in the minimum size, which would decrease discards, presumably somewhat, would be accounting for that when setting those measures. If we need more restrictive measures, the compensating for the increase in discards that we might get from an increase in minimum size would come through in the measures that we would then receive from the model. And so the power is how we address discards and incorporate the differential impacts that those measures have on discards. Is that all correct?
Yes.
John Clark. Doug Haymans. I think both you guys are still muted on your end, the way it looks on my computer. Yeah, Steven's confirmed you guys are still muted on your end. Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, while we wait for those guys to unmute. Julia, could you do me a favor and put up the chart that you and I talked about relative to the magnitude of discards? Because I think there's probably some folks around the table that don't know what discards are, what percentage of the catch discards represent. You actually have the chart.
Yeah, I have these charts for summer funner scup and black sea bass that I just pulled them out of our fishery information documents. So black sea bass of those species has the highest proportion of recreational discards. And this is only showing the dead discards. So for black sea bass, only 15% of the discards count as dead discards. So if you count live and dead discards, there'd be a lot more discards than what's shown here. But just in terms of dead catch, over the most recent 5 years for black sea bass, recreational dead discards were 18% of total dead catch, commercial and recreational, and 27% of just the recreational dead catch. And again, that's just accounting for the dead discards, but there's if you add in the live discards, it's a lot higher. So there's a lot of black sea bass discards, and then I have the next two slides for summer flounder and scup, which still have notable amounts of recreational dead discards, but not quite as high of a proportion as black sea bass.
Julia, do you have the table of all the discards? So you just mentioned it. Do you actually, I just want folks to see that when we talk about catch for black sea bass, for example, you're talking about 90% of the catch is discarded, right?
Yeah, I don't have that particular table ready to go, but you're right that in black sea bass in recent years, if you count all of the catch, live and dead discards, it's about 90% of it is discarded for black sea bass.
Thanks.
Doug, let's try it again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, I've had to dial in on the phone in order to get audio. So a comment and then a question at the end regarding the switch to may versus will. I support that. That seems to provide flexibility to me, and I'm all for the boards and commissions having and councils having maximum flexibility. But regarding C or D, you know, it's written throughout the document that one of the goals of this recreational setting process is to provide stability. And I just don't see the stability in option D. And in reading through some of the comments and also what was just presented, there was, I guess, I don't know, it mentioned 7 to 9 years as possibly the term in which we may be between AM changes. That doesn't scare me, 7 to 9 years, but I thought we were really talking about reviewing this every 5 years. And so the question is, you know, where did that 7 to 9 years get generated? I think that was like page 9 of the document. And then another comment that I meant to make earlier is that the other part about taking discards off the top, you know, at least in the South Atlantic, I think we all look at the red snapper issue and see that removing discards from the top is part of our problem. And I think we've painted ourselves into a corner in the South Atlantic, and I don't want to see the same thing happen here. So those are my comments and one question. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Julia. I can address the 7 to 9 year thing because that was in the council staff recommendation memo. So that was under the assumption that if we implement a new process that becomes effective in 2026, and then we wait 5 years to review it, and then based on the results of that review, the council and policy board want to initiate a new management action, then that new management action could take 1 to 3 years to finalize, like this one took 3 years. So like getting to the place where a new management action is finalized on that timeline, that's where it would be 7 to 9 years. But you know, it could be done sooner than that if the review happens before 5 years, or if the management action is more simple and takes less than 3 years. But that was just an example of a time frame, assuming a review starts after 5 years of implementation and then 1 to 3 years for a review for another management action to change things after that.
A brief follow-up, if I may.
Yes,
But
go ahead.
if we're on the 5-year review point, the 5 year actually starts. Eventually, we should be on a 5-year process, not something that takes 7 or 9 years. And again, 7 to 9 years is stability, in my opinion, but I'm willing to go with 5 as well. In other words, what I'm asking or saying is that it won't always be a decade between changes. If we went with option C, yes.
Yeah, I'll just add that committing to a review after 5 years doesn't mean that a review could happen sooner, or like a new management action could happen sooner. Like if there's a problem that comes up sooner than that, or a strong desire to do a new management action sooner than that, that's still possible. It's not saying that we're gonna, you know, definitely make no changes for that long. It's just an example of a timeline, but changes could be considered sooner if desired.
Adam?
We've heard a lot of questions so far, Mr. Chairman. I'm just wondering if you're ready to start off with a motion to get the conversation moving in decision-making direction.
I still have one or two more hands and then I'll call on you. Nicola?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As a follow-up to what Dr. Moore was pointing out in terms of each of the species having their own unique kept to caught ratio. Let's say, for example, fluke, scup, and sea bass all fell into a 10% catch reduction bin. Because sea bass has the highest ratio of releases to caught, am I correct in thinking that the percent reduction in harvest for black sea bass would actually be greater than the other two species and greater than 10% because of that? Because we've already driven the fishery towards more releases.
I guess maybe to make sure I understand the question, if you need to restrict your measures under option D, I might have missed if you specified under C and D, but if under D you need to achieve, for example, a 10% reduction in total dead catch for black sea bass, if you have a 15% discard mortality rate compared to 10%, for example, for summer flounder, I think you could probably say that you might get slightly more bang for your buck with your measures that way for black sea bass because you're having more of an impact. I'm kind of like thinking on the fly here that if more of your discards are assumed to die, that your measures would have a bigger impact on dead catch compared to under a lower discard mortality rate. But given that, you know, it's 10 or 15 either way, it's still, that's still a minority of the discards that are assumed to die in either case. Like, I think the conclusion still holds regardless of what I was saying about when you need to change measures to achieve that, whatever the percent change is in harvest or dead catch, that you have a lesser impact on dead catch for a given set of measures because the discard mortality rates are so low. I think Chelsea might want to add on here. I'm not sure if I'm like totally answering the question. Yeah, I think like the conclusion about needing to change your measures more to achieve a specified percent change in catch. I think that's true regardless of species, just like the details of like exactly how much you need to change them under any scenario, like that would vary based on things like you said, like the species and the data that goes into it. So sorry, I'm not sure. Maybe you can reiterate if I'm not directly answering your question.
Yeah, thank you. I think what I'm trying to say, as you've already pointed out in one of the analysis, is that a 10% reduction required for catch really requires a larger percent reduction in harvest. And my understanding would also be that for species that have a higher percentage of the catch already being released, that the equivalent percent reduction in harvest would be greater. So black sea bass, where we've already driven the fishery towards more releases, and it's largely the reason I would say that, you know, we have been going down the road of trying to figure out a different approach than the status quo, that just the measures are going to get that much more restrictive under a catch-based approach. But maybe it's more discussion than a question at this point. So thanks.
Anna?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I had mentioned earlier in the morning, I did have a motion that would provide a possible compromise for everything that we've sort of heard. And I apologize for stepping over you because I had mentioned to Wes that I might have a beginning discussion to bring us all together. Julia, would you bring up that motion? My intent here is to take the concerns that we've heard for C, the recognition that D is probably where we need to end up, but folks maybe aren't quite comfortable with D yet. And also to hopefully save some staff time in the future from not having to go through a full amendment process again to consider a change. So my motion for consideration is I move to approve option C and C2 and D and D2 with a delayed implementation until the 2030 and 2031 specification cycle for option D and D2. Option C and C2 will be effective for summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, starting with the 2026 measures, and for bluefish, starting with the 2028 measures. My hope is that this sort of reaches across all the concerns and at least we can begin discussion with this if I can get a second.
Do we have a second? Greg Hewitt with a second.
Okay, those are both council only members. So do we have a hand for the board for this option? Doug Heyman? Okay, thanks, Doug. Is there a second? See Joe Grist.
Anna, would you like to provide some rationale, please?
Sure. We received plenty of public comment in support of C and a fair bit of concerns over option D, but certainly I think that there is a recognition that option D is still supported by a number of members and maybe is where we sort of need to end up, but it has not had enough opportunity to perform for us to really recognize how it would fare. So my idea with delaying implementation for D would be that we would have 2 specification cycles to see how it would perform side by side with what we're currently doing or what we would be doing under option C to see how it will perform and give folks some comfort, or if it doesn't perform well, some time to make an alternate decision in the future. And by having a delayed implementation where it sort of automatically kicks in, it would save quite a bit of staff time in the long run. So that's my initial rationale. Thanks.
Greg, do you have anything to add?
Anyway, yeah, I think that Anna, put it perfectly. I think it applies to a nice compromise for the group and everything. And then it does run the cycle for, the 4 years and everything. And then we can review it as it goes along. So I think that, it really does give us the compromise and possibility, the stability that we're looking for in the future. And we can make changes and adjustments as we get there. And I think it's going to save some time here and some argument too, if we can kind of adjust to that and just work with everyone here and as opposed to going back and forth with it. But I think it's a good motion. Thank you, Anna.
And I'll go to the maker and second for the board. Doug, do you want to provide any rationale?
No, I was seconding for discussion purposes from my friend from North Carolina. But I am interested to see how it plays out. I do support C and C2. But I'm willing to see this side-by-side comparison. I think it means that we would have to come back in 2030. Well, y'all will, because I won't be around. But come back in 2030 and re-examine D and D2. But thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Anna's done a good job covering. It gives us an option to discuss. I like the compromise because I see benefits in both options. And this seems like a good way to bridge them.
Jeff Galen.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So to Anna, is the intent that even in the 2026 to 2027 cycle, we would see the RDM outcomes of D that we could use potentially. I really have a problem with putting off using D for 5 years. A lot can happen. And we've heard from the SSC more than once, particularly on black sea bass, you can drive a healthy stock into an overfish situation very easily without controls. To go 5 years without real, examining whether that's happening or not is an awfully long time. And my concern is that I know some people's long game is to borrow commercial catch to be able to make up for all these overages on the other side, particularly with black sea bass. 5 years is an incredibly long period of time to consider, further accountability measures. Honestly, it's just I have a really, really hard time with that kind of a time frame. It makes a lot more sense to me to take a look at both C and D in the next spec cycle and have an opportunity to use D and keep that alive, but not put it off until 2030. I mean, I'll be 80 then. I'll probably still be here, but I'll hang around long enough if I have to. But I just think that's a particularly long period of time to wait. We don't, all the years I've been around the management table, 5 years until we can take a look at whether or not we need to tighten things up is an extraordinarily long period of time, and I'm totally opposed to it personally. So, if we were going to look at D2 or C and D at the same time and make a determination as to which one we want to select down the road, to me that makes sense. But to wait 5 years is, I can't understand why we would ever make that decision, frankly, given the uncertainties and the fact that we know that borrowing is still on the minds of a lot of people. And that's a real problem for us. We've certified these fisheries. That, depending on the quota we have, is how we build those markets. So to just, turn a blind eye for 5 years, I'm having difficulty with it, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Anna.
So I guess my question to Mike Petney would be if that would be possible, because when I sort of talked through the options, a delayed implementation would be cleaner from moving one to the other. But if to have both active as options at the same time, with our ability to sort of choose between either or, was not something that seemed like it was completely viable.
I think procedurally, I think the council and the commission could adopt both and have them available for next year. I guess the concern would be the implication that council and the board would be comparing two different approaches to setting measures and cherry picking. The approach that gives, the desired outcome. Where I think that there is, the support for the motion as written is more in terms of, we have a fixed transition date in advance. We know when it's going to be, and there's no additional council, commission action or rulemaking required to transition from alternative C to alternative D. And so I think, the intent behind the motion, which I can appreciate, is, we heard a lot of public support for option C and some hesitancy around alternative option D. So we start off with option C and get more familiar with the implications of alternative D over the next couple of cycles, and then automatically transition. So I can understand and appreciate the motivation behind the motion, but I think having both available, while technically feasible, this cherry picking idea is something that, I think we have to be aware of and make a decision about.
Mike Luigi.
Yeah, thanks. So Mike, I just want to make sure I'm clear. This motion's fine. It's just doing what Jeff suggested and having two to compare from would be problematic in your eyes. But the motion as it currently reads and transitions at a given date is okay from a Garfield perspective.
From a procedural perspective, I don't see any fundamental flaws in this motion. You're saying we're going to use this approach for the next 2 cycles, and then we're going to transition to another approach for the cycles after that. You know, I'm not giving my opinion on the motion. I'm just saying whether or not it's technically feasible and a reasonable procedural approach, and I think it is.
Michelle?
Yeah, I guess I think some of my question has been answered about, and you know, I think this is a question for staff, like having, because, you know, presumably we would be using the RDM for, you know, option C, should this motion move forward, that, you know, we're still getting this, all the same information as we would if we were using option D. And so we're just sort of storing that in the background to, you know, to compare how our you know, I guess maybe current course approach of estimating or projecting, forecasting discards compares to what's coming out of the back end of the RDM. And so we're just kind of holding that in reserve as an analysis until the 2030 spec cycle. I mean, is that, I just want to make sure everybody's got a common understanding of what's happening in the background should this motion move forward. And I guess maybe, you know, I don't know. All right, I'll stick comments later, but question. Thank you.
Yes, that's correct. We could work with Northeast Fishery Science staff to make sure that we're getting outputs for both and keeping that as a record to compare.
Mike?
Yeah, I think it's certainly reasonable to take this approach. I think, you know, one thing I want people to be aware of is what we're asking the RDM to do and what it's really built to do. And, you know, hearing from Scott Steinbeck, who basically built this with a lot of help, but you know, he understands what it's doing. And I think one of the concerns is that when we're using, say, option C, we're making an assumption about discards, and then we're asking the RDM to give us measures. And if the estimate of discards is off, and we've seen, you know, that it can be off quite a lot based on the performance, then we're asking the RDM, we're basically giving the RDM an incorrect starting point and asking it to give us the best estimate of what the measure should be. So option D, again, the power of option D is in that it is using the RDM to its full capability to tell us what the discards are expected to be under different sets of measures. And so really, if we, you know, I appreciate all the work that's gone into the RDM, and I think we ought to be using it to its full capability. And so I think alternative D is what allows us to do that. You know, to get a little bit beyond my comment, I was kind of hoping that we would see a motion for an alternative, just the adoption of alternative D. And I recognize that, you know, based on the public hearings, there is a lot of support for alternative C and some hesitancy about alternative C. So, you know, I think the proposed compromise, I think, is a reasonable compromise if there's not the support for alternative D. You know, the goal I think we should all have is to be incorporating discards to the maximum extent possible in the decisions that we make, trying to minimize those discards, reduce discards, and selecting measures that ultimately reduce those discards. And I think alternative D is what gives us the tools and the procedure to do just that.
Jason McNamee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you guys hear me? Looks like it's working.
Yes, you sound fine.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the time. I'm going to kind of lead in just with a couple of quick comments. You know, thinking about this ahead of time, I really wanted to, like badly wanted to agree with staff recommendation, FMAT, PDT recommendation. They're really nice work by those groups. Good reasoning, really well thought out justifications. I really appreciated all of that. And this underlying discussion about discards, we care about discards. We talk about them all the time. We know they're an issue in many of our fisheries. And so, I recognized all of that, badly wanted to account for it, but I had this underlying concern. And just to add, I really liked that performance evaluation that the team did as well. But what we learned kind of, supported some of my concerns, and that is when you incorporate the discards, you mute the effect of the management that you're trying to achieve, and it's muted because you're not achieving that. I kind of recognize that, but the magnitude of that was what was really concerning me. Are we going to pin ourselves to a 40% reduction every single time because we just can't, implement measures? In some of the cases of these species, there's not a lot of room left to make adjustments. And so I had this significant concern that we were not going to meet our management goals because, we were going to set ourselves up to have to take these giant, adjustments every single time. So I really appreciate this motion. I was thinking along the same lines, like I was wondering if there was a way that we could take the output of discards and use it in sort of the risk policy context instead of the exact accountability. But here, the other thing I was hoping to see is a performance evaluation. They did that already, kind of looking backwards, but this would give us in real time an ability to kind of compare, see whether or not, they're different. The disc, when you do option D, it mutes the effect a little bit, but you don't have to, pin it to a 40% reduction every time to get a needed effect. So long story short, I really like this this motion and support it, but I do have one question I'm hoping that would just kind of lock me in here, and that is, if we see this performance and it's not something we prefer, what does it look like to actually intervene and stop us from transitioning to option D? What if, I'm just saying, like, if we end up in that extreme circumstance and it's not tenable, what is the process to stop that? Are we giving ourselves enough time to be able to do that? So I just want to make sure that we've thought through, we're going to compare things for a number of years, and then we're going to make a judgment based on that comparison. So I just want to make sure that we're going to have time to implement that judgment if we were to not want to transition to D. So thanks for the time. I really appreciate it.
As currently written, the motion, if you're doing comparisons every year and the Council and Policy Board decide they do not want to go with option D, we would have to do another management action to counteract this motion and the amendment and framework.
Nicola?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think Jason really just made all the points that I have largely in support of option C. And my concern with this motion is not being able to stop that transition if the ongoing performance evaluation suggests that it should not occur. So I'm having a little trouble supporting the concept of that automatic transition. I think my earlier question about what recreational measures means in the context of these options, it really concerns me that option D would hold us to a catch-based performance metric and can't change measures to address a large part of that source of removals. I don't disagree that the council and board need to be more attentive to and give all due consideration to releases. But I'm worried about the effect of doing so here, and also think that there's another opportunity for the board in particular to consider the impact of measures on discards when it approves the state proposals to achieve reductions or liberalizations. In the past, we've always just said, okay, yes, that achieves the 10% harvest reduction or whatever the number is for the year. And we've not really looked at the discards. And I think the board could certainly be more attentive to that and potentially not approve certain measures in states if the measures would drive releases too far. So I think there are other ways that we could provide some additional attention to releases, and I feel comfortable with the selection of option C at this time, and I'm just worried about that automatic transition. It seems to go counter to the idea of the ongoing evaluation. Thank you.
Yasmina?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I probably should have said this at the beginning of the meeting that I have a joint role here as both the policy board chair, but I am also a member of the council, be voting for the council. But so what I heard in the presentation, when I think I heard the RA say a couple of times, confuses me. I heard that option C or D does not need to use the RDM at all, but then the idea that the power of option D is how it uses the RDM and its use of discards, but the RDM will spit out the same discard estimate for C and D. It's just how we choose to use it versus it's more formulaic. Is that correct?
Yes, the RDM, the rec demand model, is not required under either, but we expect it to be used under both. And you're right, it's just the information that it outputs. We'd be required to consider more of it under D than under C. And under C, there's the option to consider it as additional supplementary information, the discards outputs, but we'd only be required to consider the harvest outputs.
Yeah, thank you. That was a concern for me on this. And then I think the only other concern that I have is kind of what Nicola and Jason have mentioned, and that's there was a lot of concern for a sunset and don't do sunset, and there is an element of sunset in this. So,
Adam?
Yeah, thank you very much. And first off, I got to extend a word of gratitude to Ms. Beckwith. I mean, this is probably about the most fast forward way the council's ever done anything in terms of motions. I fully expected a motion, a substitute, something would fail to get to this point. I think this pretty much fast forwards to likely where we would have ended up today anyway, given the support that was in this room for both C and D coming in here today. I've one who would support getting to catch at some point. I am one that would support making the maximum use of discard data to its best usage with the limitations and concerns that are surrounding how we derive it. Probably walked in here today leaning towards the concept of option C, using harvest with some revisit provision, which would have us considering using catch at some point in the 3 to 5 year timeline, again, which this already does, but as Nicholas suggested and Joe just mentioned as well, does force our hand a bit with that sunset aspect. So I do think that introduces an element of risk to us as council and commission members around the table that everyone's going to have to consider. It's not in this motion. I've heard multiple people, though, bring it up that the expectation here is that there is a comparison of the outputs of the RDM for both a catch-based measures and harvest-based measures would be generated during the next two specification cycle. I think it's in order for this to work, that has to happen. There can't be any possibility that we pass this motion. It's not inherent in the motion. The Science Center comes back at some point and says, we can't do that comparison for you. We have to look at those two things together. I also think that I would hope that for the next two specification cycles, as if this were to pass and we worked with Harvest, I would hope that this would not give the technical bodies involved with making a recommendation how to utilize discards, essentially a pass to say, we're going to keep considering discards, how we've considered discards. I hope if this passes that the monitoring committee, the technical committee, staff will continue to look at ways we can make better use of discards in the existing process that uses harvest. I don't want to just walk away from that. I also think we need to give consideration as to whether the percent changes, the 10, 20, 40. Certainly part of the analysis suggested that for catch, that perhaps the 40 number wasn't right and that something closer to 30 would be more appropriate. Further analysis of that option isn't explicit within this motion. And I do think that that's something that would need to be considered and analyzed before we go to this. So where does that leave me today as a member of the commission voting on this? Again, I suspect we probably would have gotten to a motion like this at some point today anyway, is my guess, knowing where people were around the table. So I'm not inclined to substitute myself, but I do think that if I did ultimately vote in support of this, I would need to hear a little bit more from staff, and maybe I'll pose that as a question at the end of this comment for staff in the service or anybody else that could chime in. What is tying us to being committed to, if we go forward with a harvest-based approach, making sure we continue to look at ways to discard, to consider how we improve our discard process, and a way that we could look at those percentages before we implement the catch-based approach that this would do as written. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Just a point of clarification, is the question like this, if the switch to option D is dependent on that annual analysis, or just what will be included in that analysis?
My read of this motion is that the switch would not be dependent on the analysis, but I do think that we need to have that analysis ongoing. The question was asked earlier, about where would be, if we're not comfortable with that, how would we have time to change direction before the 2030 timeline for the switch? I would see that would probably have to occur after this first specification cycle. We would look at the comparison and say, maybe not as good as we hoped it's performing. And as soon as that second specification cycle came out, if it repeated the angst that individuals had about the potential switch to D, we'd have to initiate something pretty much immediately. It would have to be on prospective action plans for both the council and the commission as a possible action item in 2028, 2029. So we'd have to be on our toes, that's a risk of it. So that answers your question, but again, getting back to my question, where is what from staff or the service says we are committed to making sure we look at how we improve discards if we continue with a harvest approach, and how do we relook at those percentages?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. So from the commission, I think we would need discussion from the policy board on the record about what you would like staff and the technical committee to look at annually and compare. We've heard today that you want, the performance of those 10, 20, 40 percentages. You want to look at catch and harvest performance outputs from things like the RDM. But any direction that can be provided by the council and policy board is helpful for us during the specifications period when we're looking at all these things, what we should or should not be comparing. I don't think we need it in a motion necessarily, but discussion would be helpful.
Mike Belisi. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I came into today's meeting kind of, as I've spoken to many of you over the last day and a half, kind of on the fence. I understand the viewpoints of those folks who are more interested in the option C. And I also understand and I can see where option D provides us a new channel for us to better ourselves as fisheries managers. Mike Pentney, I think, was very clear in that the tool developed and the tool in what we can use it for is fully executed by considering discards in how we adjust for recreational measures. That there have been so many times over the years where we've sat around these tables and heard from the public as we're considering management options, and they tell us directly, you're not, by raising the minimum size limit, discards are going to increase and you're only doing the stock more harm than good. And I see this action and this opportunity today as taking the next step into getting to a point where we are considering the discard information as we're contemplating measures. And there are too many times we're faced with the challenge of sitting in front of the public who we represent and having to make a choice when the impacts are fully understood and fully known. And we have to evaluate those impacts. And I've heard a lot today about concerns about what may happen. Well, those concerns are going to be there no matter what we decide today. I think there's always going to be a concern about the future because it hasn't happened yet. We're not there yet. And I just see that this action, because we're not deciding on a measure, there is no truly understood impact to what we're doing. It brings it back to me. What do I think I need to do my job better? And what I need to do my job better is different from what we've been doing. And when I look at our ability as a board, as a council, in predicting what discards are going to be in the future, we're not doing a really good job at that. It's clear that we're not predicting well what will happen as a result of the actions that we take. And so I have, since early this morning, really, I'm dug in on D at this point. I really think that option D does the best job for us to give us the tools that we need. But I also, for those of you who know me, I'm very much into compromising between groups and trying to find some middle ground that kind of addresses the concerns from both camps. And so this motion does that. Where I have concerns about this is that 5 years is too long for me. It may not be too long for others, but it's too long for me. I think that we have the tools. We can look at a comparison of our decisions over the next couple years and not 2 cycles of specifications. I think a more quick turnaround to moving to option D to see happen more rapidly. And the fear about the magnitude of change, I think the magnitude of change will reflect how off we are. If we're really off in what we're doing, there's going to be an immediate change. That magnitude will hopefully get us to a more accurate, realistic fishery than the slower, less impactful changes over time that will drag out for a long period of time. So with all of that said, I'm going to take a stab at supporting this motion, but with a simple amendment. And so I would like to move to amend this motion to strike 2030 to 2031 and replace that with 2028 and 2029. And if my timing is right, with the way our specification cycles would work, that would give us 1 full specification cycle to do this kind of comparison analysis. And then it would trigger at the same time Bluefish triggers. So it folds all in together in 2028. Bluefish, black sea bass, summer flounder, and scup all fall into this new way for us to manage these fisheries in a couple years shorter time. So I'll leave it at that. I am also representing. I'm vice chair of the council, but I'm sitting as proxy to Lynn Fagley, who is our policy board representative for the state of Maryland. So I'll make that motion on behalf of the council and the policy board, Mr. Chairman, and I'll see if we get a second.
Chris Batsevich.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll second that for the council and the board.
Anna.
Thanks. I probably won't support this, but to kind of go back to some of the comments that folks had on what happens, if you're not happy with the transition, my thought process with the original motion was it is faster to have a 1 action amendment to either provide an additional delay or to reestablish C as the continued management option than to go through a full amendment. So I think timing wise, it would be faster if we get to whatever specification year and that we're going to transition and we're uncomfortable with D, it would be faster to sort of go in and say, okay, we're not comfortable with D. Let's either do an additional delay or just stay with C instead of doing like a full amendment process. So that was one of the reasons why I decided to word it the way I did with an automatic implementation rather than going through the 5-year review and then starting the whole process on a larger amendment. So 1 action amendments tend to be faster.
Thanks, Anna. We've got a number of hands. Mike, I'm assuming that you gave your justification for the motion with the motion. So, okay. Chris, you had your hand up and you are a seconder. So did you have justification?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Mike beat me to the punch, so thank you. And basically raised many of the concerns I had, and I had share a lot of the concerns and comments made already, and just kind of on the record, I was coming into this meeting supporting option D from the get-go, but obviously, support a compromise to transition to D. But I just think we need to do it sooner. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. I do see a number of hands, and I would like to clear the list. If I think most of the hands I've seen are in the queue, but we also had Scott Steinbeck. So I think, if Scott had some clarifying information for some of the stuff that was said, I think that might be important to get to. So, Scott.
Hi there. Thank you. I just wanted to point out that I think it will be really difficult to directly compare C and D side by side as time goes on. And the reason is that you could possibly end up in a different bin in the percent change approach, requiring, a different percentage relaxation or reduction. And therefore, that would result in different measures under those two scenarios. And that would translate into the following assessment period, different starting points. The status quo measures would be different. All of the data that feeds into the RDM would be affected as well. Status quo catch per trip, everything would change. So it would be, and you wouldn't know what the states would implement under that scenario, under option D, if we had option C in place. So we wouldn't be able to run equivalent measures through. We wouldn't know what they would have chosen. So I'm not sure how we could make comparisons moving forward, direct comparisons anyway, moving forward with these two approaches using the RDM. So I just wanted to point that out. Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate that very, very much, because there was an assumption here that the idea behind this sunsetting is we're going to understand the performance of both measures, or the results under either option, and that should have been a question by us. So I appreciate you very much jumping in. That assumption may not stand, and I think that's very important for all the board members here to understand the idea of sunsetting and just moving from one to the other without really knowing how they performed under the same set of regulations. So thank you very much for that. And I'm going to take one more and then pass the mic back over. So Megan Ware, you had your hand up for a while, so please go ahead.
Thanks, Joe. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, you sound good.
Excellent. My question, it applies to either motion on the board here, is are we approving option D as written in this motion, or is there any room to change or modify option D as we learn more? For example, the percent either liberalizations or reductions.
Oh, I guess if that's a question to the makers, I guess we'll start with the amendment. Okay, well, also we have John Almeida. So. Yeah, I guess it's tough. Yeah, well, I guess right. So I guess this is the board and council's motion now. So I guess this is more of a policy question.
Is that the answer, Joe? Sorry, I think you may be talking to someone and I can't hear them off the mic.
Yeah, sorry for that very long sidebar. But no, the assumption we believe is that what's in the motion is there. So that would, if there was the idea of additional changes, they would need to be an additional motion.
Okay. Just to follow up to that, so I generally agree option D is where we should go. I'm a little hesitant to do that as written today just because of some of the staff analysis that suggested that highest either reduction or liberalization should be a different number. And I think that's potentially a double whammy in this case, given it's harder to achieve percent reductions in catch than harvest. So that's really what's making me pause on option D for the moment. I think if we had an opportunity to modify option D as we learn more, that would make me a little more comfortable with these motions. But if we're approving something as written, I'm going to, I think, have some hesitancy just on how option D is right now and some of that preliminary analysis we received. So thanks.
Mike Penny.
Yeah, thanks. Just I'm going to respond maybe to Megan's point, because we had some similar conversations with the regional office about the analysis, 30% versus 40%. I think what led me to be comfortable with the way that option D and C are written now is those reductions and liberalizations are effectively up to 40%. And so we would rely on the monitoring committee, when it's running through its analysis in advance of the December meetings, to give us information in terms of what is an appropriate either liberalization or reduction, given the approach and the procedure and model that we're using. And so while, maybe at some point in the future, we would want to consider changing those percentages as we learn and work through these different options. I think for now, we reached a place where we're comfortable because of that up to caveat that allows the monitoring committee to do a full evaluation.
John Almeida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had a question, maybe some clarification from the makers of the motion. The second part of the original motion talks about how option C and C2 will be effective starting this next specification cycle. And then it says, and for bluefish starting with the 2028 measures. As I read the motion to amend, the intent of the motion to amend is to start using alternative D during the 2028 cycle. So would the intent be, I guess, is the intent to use alternative D for all of these species, or would bluefish be treated under alternative C?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I was not clear in the motion, but what's in my mind is that in 2028, option D would be what we use for all the species. That would be like the starting point for summer flounder, black sea bass, scup, and bluefish. So whatever we're using for bluefish the next couple of years, it's under the rebuilding plan, but it changes with the other species as they change at the same time. That was the intent. If we have to modify the language, I don't know that can discussed it, or if that intent is understood. I mean, it's up to you, Mr. Chairman, if you want to.
I think we understand the intent. I think it's good. John, are you okay with that?
I mean, I guess we're treating it as a friendly without changing it. Maybe we just,
Can we add the word? Can we put the language in there to make it more clear?
yeah, I mean, I think if you just strike and for bluefish, the second half of that sentence, that would accomplish what you're saying. And I don't know if you want to treat that as a friendly amendment to Mike's motion.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry about this, but I think it would read more clearly if we after 2026 measures and, then the words would be after and, option D and D2 for summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish, starting with the 2028 measures. Just an insertion of that those additional species and options at this in the second half of the second paragraph.
Yeah, let's get this up first, Anna.
Just for staff clarity, this doesn't clarify now what would happen for bluefish in 2026.
Go ahead, Mike. You want to try it again? Yeah.
Okay, so for bluefish, we're not doing anything different in 2026 and 2027. That was the recommendation, right? So
Yes, so that was the recommendation, but I don't think that is reflected in the motion. It would need to have a delayed implementation for bluefish in 2028. Because right now this doesn't specify, I guess, at all what would happen with bluefish in 2026. It just says summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. Julie, is that how you're?
I guess we're unclear if this motion would be read to mean bluefish uses option C in 2026, or if it sticks with the current process for 2026. And if, as long as like maybe I'm just confused, if it's clear, if everybody's clear about what happens for bluefish in 2026 and 2027, then maybe it's okay. But so I think it's clear that starting in 2028, everybody, including bluefish, moves to option D, but we're just trying to make sure it's clear what happens for 2026 and 2027 for bluefish. And while I have the mic, so there was also some staff discussion that it might help to say, instead of 2028 through 2029, to say 2028 and beyond, just to make it more clear that like, this is what we want for the future and it's not just for that specification cycle. I think it could be fine either way, but if we think that clarification is helpful, that could also be considered, just to, you know, make things a little bit more confusing. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's under the assumption 26 and 27 stay the same for bluefish, and then the option D would start in 2028 and beyond. I guess we have to add that.
So we were just talking, it may be better just to, why don't you grab the motion and we'll just rewrite the motion. We can rewrite it to be specific.
Could you give us 2 minutes, like a 2-minute break to wordsmith, figure this out?
All right, let's take a break till 11:25. We'll come back at 11:25. All right, if everyone can find their seats, we're going to get started here in about a minute. All right, if everyone can find their seats, let's get started. All right, welcome back, everyone. We've got the language straight now. The motion will now read: move to approve options C and C2 for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass for 2026-2027, and approve options D and D2 for 2028 and beyond for summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish. Mike, are you okay with this? Chris, are you okay with this? All right, now that we've got this straight, Michelle Duvall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think like others have expressed around the table, I've gone back and forth on this issue between C and D, and I came into this meeting, leaning towards D. I think, this has come down to issues of back and forth between C and D, and I came into this meeting, leaning towards D. I think this has come down to issues of. You're muted, right? You're muted.
Michelle is now AI.
Let's try this again. So I think what I was trying to say is that, this has come down to the issues of uncertainty and stability. And I think, as I've struggled with this, and I really appreciate all the conversations that I've had with folks around the table with respect to uncertainty, it seems like we're just really trading between these two options of C and D, that we're really just trading one form of uncertainty for another. So, there's the uncertainty that folks are concerned about with respect to recall bias that is incorporated in the catch per trip and how that is propagated through the RDM versus, the uncertainty associated with a static estimate of discards. And I think my concern that would be used under option C. And I think my concern about that static estimate of discards is that it can be biased either high or low. And we aren't going to know that until we then use the RDM to work through a set of measures that, would be applied to achieve the RHL. And so I think that combination of, this course method of developing a discard estimate in combination with that potential bias sort of has me, is what primarily tips me towards option D. And I think, I appreciate what Mike Luisi said about trying to get to option D sooner. I do think that's where, we need to be. and for that reason, I'm supportive of this motion, but until I heard what Scott Steinbeck had to say about, what the baseline is with respect to the analysis, and that, I don't want to walk down that rabbit hole. Suffice it to say that was really informative. And, and with respect to stability, I think we really don't know for sure. I mean, what the analysis that staff did indicate that, yes, there may be greater magnitude of adjustments that might be needed under option D, but I don't know that we know for sure. And I think the possibility of a 40% swing in either direction, makes me question the use of the term stability. So I'll just leave it there, but I appreciate all the work that's gone into this and all the conversations that I've had. Thank you.
Rich Wong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also appreciate all the work that the staff and the FMAT have put into this amendment. The real beauty with Anna's original motion in the delay is not necessarily, well, it's really it gives us time to address the major flaw with option D. If you're going to use MRIP total catch weight as the basis for your regulation changes, we absolutely need to improve the discard size sampling by MRIP in order to make that work. Right now, the MRIP discard size sampling comes from one mode, and it's a small mode. It's around 5% of the total catch. And that's the party boat mode. And in that mode, they sample only a handful. For example, in Delaware, we sample only a handful of party boat trips a year. And we're using that discard size information to characterize the entire discard that's occurring in the fisheries. And as Chris Moore noted, that's like the discard is about 10 times the harvest. This is a very, very large number. And what MRIP does is they estimate this number, this discard number, that's the discard estimate is in numbers. It's not in weight. It has to be converted to weight. In order for that to occur, you have to have size sampling. Okay, use a mean weight to convert the numbers into pounds. And that's what we're using to make regulation changes from one year to the next. It's actually, I mean, the intent for option D is excellent. I like it. And I think that is where we should be going in the future. But we are not ready yet for that. And until the council or an MRIP throws some resources towards improving the discard size sampling, I think it's actually potentially very, very dangerous way to manage the fishery. That's my opinion on that. Thank you.
Matt Yates.
Thank you. I came into this discussion firmly in the C camp. That's where I was from sort of a northern area perspective, in that there's the magnitude of changes required under option D would just, I thought further drive changes in the difference in regulations between either the northern region and the southern region, or even within just the northern region states themselves. There's already in sea bass, for instance, a disparity in rules between states, and requiring bigger changes at a time, I felt would make that even worse. And so I came into this in the C camp, recognizing that D has some obvious on paper improvements by looking at the discards and accounting for them in advance. Sounds great. But I just don't think we're ready for it yet. And I thought that the original motion here that gave us 5 years-ish time two spec cycles to look it over and maybe develop some comfort with with both our recreational fishermen and us at the table. I thought maybe it gets us a better chance of getting to that position of starting to look at discards. So I would be in favor of the original motion, but not this substitute. Thank you.
Doug Grout.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would have, I certainly appreciate Ms. Bestwick's motion, and I was leaning toward supporting it. I would be okay with Mr. Luisi's substitute motion if it weren't for the fact that bluefish, we're not going to be using option C and C2 for bluefish during the period during this specification cycle. So that's the main reason why I'll likely that I'm opposed to the motion to amend. I'd also like to address the request by, I believe it was Tony, that the board, the policy board, should make an explicit request for both the model to be run with both under option C and D each year. And I appreciate Scott Steinbeck's comments that indicate that, this really wouldn't be feasible, particularly as you in later years, because you don't know what would have been done under option D. So I would still like to make sure that that piece of information is provided every year as we go through the specification cycle. Thank you.
Mike Luisi.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to Doug, I might need every vote I can get here. So I think to your question about bluefish, it's my understanding that bluefish under a rebuilding plan is not afforded the flexibilities that option C and D allow, and that until bluefish is rebuilt, it needs to stay within its own set of rules that kind of keep those measures in some shape, right? I don't know if I'm saying that the right way, but Chelsea might be able to help.
Yeah, so bluefish is subject to the rules of the Amendment 2 Rebuilding Plan. Bluefish will be undergoing a management track assessment this year in 2025. And unless they come out of that rebuilding plan, they will stay subject to Amendment 2. If they come out based on this motion, they would go back to the previous method of setting measures until 2028. But if it stays in the rebuilding plan, it's subject to that rebuilding plan and not this new process until it reaches the target.
Doug Haymans.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. So Adam's comments earlier were very foretelling. Here we are with amendments to amendments. So as I guess the previous commenter, I came in fully in support of C2. I seconded Anna's motion for a point of discussion and was willing to go with that. But then we heard, and I'm sorry, I don't know who all was speaking, but perhaps Scott from FMAT suggested there wouldn't be a comparison opportunity for the two programs. So I am back to where I started. We're wanting C2. I've heard a fair amount of comment around the room for support for both. I would love if there were some way that we could do a straw poll to see where support for C or D landed before we actually went into this compromise. And I don't know if that's something the chairs are willing to to consider or not, but I am not in favor of this motion, of the amended motion.
Jim Gilmore.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm just harking back to a bunch of us around the table, to the days of chasing the RHL. And the one word that we got from that whole exercise and why we got to the percent change approach was stability. So that's I think the word that jumps out at me. So at this point, I like the original motion mainly because we're looking at time. If we go with the substitute motion, we're talking about one data point in 2 years. And that I think is going to put us in another quandary, because now we're going to have to take that one data point based on MREP, that great data that we get, and then we're going to be back around the table arguing about, do we want to change it now, whatever, and we're sort of on this, critical path. So as much as I understand the intent of the substitute, I still think it's going too fast, and we really need to get at least a couple of cycles under this before we start, deciding which way is going to be the permanent solution to this. And again, as much as 5 years seems like a long time, I mean, for us around the table, boy, we've gone a decade without making management changes, whatever, and still we're able to succeed in that. So at this point, I'm opposed to the substitute motion and in favor of the original motion. And again, it really comes down to that point that we even back to Magnuson, we used to need the best available data. Well, if we got 2 data points, I think that's better data than 1. So thank you.
Adam Nowalski.
Thank you. So as a couple people have mentioned, my earlier comments about expediting the process of motions here today did not age well. I take full responsibility of that. Perhaps Mike put this motion up just to make me look bad for those comments. Regardless of what the reason is, I can't support the amended motion here. Essentially, this is just option D, does not afford us any of the analysis we'd hope to gain by the compromise motion that was put forth by Ms. Beckwith earlier. I certainly appreciate the comments from Scott regarding that we're not going to have a full-blown analysis from the RDM because the percent changes may have differed using catch versus harvest. He's 100% correct on that. My vision of what the analysis would look like, however, is spelled out in the first paragraph in the methods of the document that the Science Center did provide to the FMAP PDT, whereby they said they ran the RDM as it was configured for the 2024 management cycle under different configurations, status quo 2023, a few hypothetical 2024 coastwide scenarios for fluke and scup, et cetera, et cetera. My vision for an analysis here would just simply be to take that paragraph, bump all the years that were in there forward 2 years in 2026, bump them forward again in 2028, and make sure that we have scup included, black sea bass, in addition to fluke and scup, and if available, which we hope it will be by 2028, bluefish as well. So that would be my vision for the analysis so that we can compare what those outputs would be. Completely understand Scott's comments, don't disagree at all, that it doesn't give us the full picture, but it at least tells us how the RDM would perform. When we question the use of the discards in management, can staff bring up the black sea bass discard performance slide again? The conversation here is really about how we're considering discards in management and the impact it has. When we look at the slide that's now up here and see that the magnitude of final discards compared to what we used in management so far exceeds, and in many cases exceeded, the ACL, this stock should be fished to borderline extinction by this point, by this slide. This slide demonstrates the mismanagement that has occurred of a abundant resource and further magnifies how much more catastrophic that regulatory process could become should we do the process of moving towards discards fully in D sooner versus later without some more analysis. The comments by Richie Wong, someone who's worked at the technical level for a very long time, understands this entirely. And for those reasons, I will oppose the motion to amend. I think it's just too close to D. Again, as others have said, I've walked into the room ready to support C, but I appreciate the efforts to get to some compromise, expedite things, and would go back to supporting the original motion. Thank you.
I'll go to the audience. Kate Wilkie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Kate Wilkie with the Nature Conservancy. We oppose any of the moves to implement one option and then switch to another. We support implementation of D with one small tweak, which was in our original public comment letter. I've heard a lot that public comment was more so on the side of C. I thought that staff presented that it was equally split between C and D, like 228 to 219. And that was even before we had a really clear explanation of the advantages of D. Julia showed us several different slides and explained it in several different ways that option D includes consideration of both harvest and discards. I haven't heard any compelling argument for option C. And in fact, using option C would intentionally ignore discard estimates that are available when setting measures, or at least wouldn't incorporate them into the process. And so in her presentation, Julia explained that a disconnect can happen in option C by not factoring in how those discards will be affected by changing the measures. The RDM is sophisticated and includes angler choice, stock size and composition, catch and discards. And as Mike Luisi pointed out, so many times we've heard from the public that if we set certain measures that we're going to increase discards. Well, option D actually considers how the measures will impact the discards. So over time, measures could hopefully be set in a way that potentially converts discards to landings. And then just another point, I have big concerns about adopting either of these motions that are incorporating a choice on the accountability measures, because we've had zero discussion or justification for choosing either option C2 or D2 over option C1 or D1. And I think that the options C2 and D2 are weak accountability measures and fear that they don't actually achieve the intent of an accountability measure. Thanks.
Greg.
Greg DiDomenico, Lund's Fisheries. It's a serious topic with a lot of people concerned on both sides, so I'll choose my words wisely. I did not come here with my mind made up at all, honestly. I've been through or listened to every PDTF Met there is and all my obligations as an AP member over the last couple of years. And I'm picking D, or I'm partial to D, because it has strength. Not because it's punitive, or not because I want the rec community to have a lower bag size or season, because of the diligent work by numerous people. And my back and forth with them over the last year and a half has always been extremely helpful and productive. So I really thank you for answering my questions. I know I've put a lot of emphasis on some things, and you guys have been always willing to answer my questions. So I really appreciate that. My concern is we have an SSC process that believes the overages and has warned everybody about the stock status of black sea bass. Yet we have a management system that doesn't. That's not going to end well. There is a departure here. That departure is going to cause the SSC to be more cautionary, and we're going to lose OFL. What do we do when the OFL goes down? Obviously, we're going to have to do the same process that you, right? Same methodology, but you're going to be working with less. I'm assuming that only ends up in one direction. Certainly lower quotas for us and more and more negative effects to the recreational fishery. I also was here and participated heavily in the allocation amendment, which was catch-based. So we used their discards then under catch-based to amplify their allocations, but not now. Now we're skeptical of the discards. Now it's not as much of an emphasis on discards. That's quite a disconnect, especially considering where the allocations are. Lastly, I can't remember a time or an example where overages didn't lead to overfishing. I certainly hope that does not happen with black sea bass, but it's happening with fluke. So I have to admit that, again, this is not sour grapes or to be derogatory to anybody's position. I have a loss of confidence now in where we're going on these demersal stocks. That's why I chose D. Thank you.
Mike Wayne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike Wayne with the American Sport Fishing Association. Couple cleanup items. The public comments were strongly in support of C, not split between C and D. I think there was a table showed multiple times during the discussion that showed overages in the catch continuously. But what that table didn't show was what the actual realized fishing mortality was associated with those overages. And those overages coming out of the stock assessment have shown that overfishing wasn't occurring. So it'd be nice to see the overfishing status associated with those overages so that folks don't get confused about whether those whether those overages led to overfishing or not. In regards to the motion to amend, I'm opposed to this. I think there was some really good discussion that led to where we're at now. And I think this is just too quick. We hear some of the Science Center staff trying to chime in on the fly about what could be done and couldn't be done. The public didn't even really get to see the analysis on D during the public comment period. And so I think right now, rushing into a decision on this isn't necessary. And I think in terms of the main motion, I don't really love that one either because I view it as a sunset of C with an automatic move to D. I think that carries some unnecessary risk. Our preferred pathway would be C with a revisit to D, which gives us more flexibility to sort out some of the unknowns associated with this discussion that was talked about today. And the other thing that has me a little concerned is the discards. I want to echo made, and I think that we really need to dig into this deeper. I'm just worried about our ability to control the discards. I've been asking the question, what management measures will we use to control the discards? How will we do it? I think the discards are a function of the regulations on the landings and fish availability. And I think Ms. Meserve asked the question, how will will there be management solutions that specifically address the discards, which would be lowering the discard mortality rate? And those aren't a part of this action. And the RDM can't really include them. And so again, this is putting a ton of focus on the discards. And in my opinion, we don't have a strong handle in management of the discards. And I don't see a pathway laid out for us to have a better handle on management of the discards. The discards will just be a function of the landings regulations and fish availability. And that makes me pretty uncomfortable, certainly jumping quickly into D and not doing a more thorough analysis like Richie was suggesting on getting a better handle of what the discards actually are. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Megan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Megan Lapsey-Fries. I want to say to start off that I agree with everything that Greg DiDomenico spoke earlier. And despite some of the comments today, the treatment between commercial and recreational management is stark, and this motion and framework does violate National Standards 1, 4, and 8. The commercial sector is not allowed to exceed its ACL. We aren't allowed to exceed our commercial quota, which is the commercial equivalent of the RHL, never mind our ACL. Commercial reductions would happen immediately if our quota was exceeded to get catch back in the box. Because in the commercial sector, we have to prevent overfishing and sustain the stocks. The balance of power resides with the fish, not the fishery. We don't get to exceed our ACL just because stocks are high. There is no liberalization allowed over the commercial quota or above the commercial ACL just because there's a lot of sea bass. That doesn't exist on the commercial side of the equation. And to clarify, the SSC is the entity saying that rec overages of the RHL and the council choosing not to manage to the RHL will cause ABC reductions for the commercial fishery. The SSC is saying that there are equity issues because the commercial sector will pay for recreational overages. I actually attend these meetings, and I don't see a lot of council members present. To the point of continuing to delay because of data, we've been dealing with allowing recreational overages since like 2017 or 18 because of not enough data. Back then it was, we aren't going to act because of new MRIP. We have to get the new data. Then new MRIP came, and then the excuse was we can't act on rec overages because we have to initiate a rec reform initiative to adjust to new MRIP and the new data. That rec reform initiative initially had rec accountability baked in as an issue to be addressed. Then it was removed. Then the council started with the current percent change approach to avoid recreational cut massive overages, including OFL overages from the rec catch, which has led to the SSC sounding the alarm multiple times. Now we are here actually talking about a document which actually includes an option for specifically allowing overfishing, which is illegal under Magnuson, and blows my mind that it was even included for consideration, and other alternatives represented in this motion that specifically allow for continued rec ACL overages. It is clear there is no desire to manage shared stocks in a way that holds both sectors to their respective quota or RHL, no national standard for compliance, and that we are headed in a direction of overfished stocks to which the commercial sector will be held to account. If the SSC lowers ABCs and commercial catch limits to account for the council's action here today, there will be problems. And the reason that I'm saying these things is not because it will change any direction of this council, but because I want to create an administrative record if we have issues later. Thank you.
James Fletcher.
James Fletcher, United National Fishermen's Association. I'm an advisor. Our association has put forth an option that totally eliminates discards, and it has not been addressed in this or any other issue. We're asking when total retention is going to be discussed. Thank you for your time, and you must understand I am extremely frustrated to have listened to this discussion knowing that an option has been on the table for at least 5 years. Thank you for your time. James Fletcher, United National Fishermen's Association.
This is for council members only. Council members only. Are we ready for the question? Motion upon us is moved to approve option C and C2 for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass for 2026, 2027, and approve options D and D2 for 2028 and beyond for summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish. If I could get Jeff and Bonnie Brady to please lower your hands. And all council members in favor, please raise your hand on the computer. I got 5. 5 counting you. All right, everybody, please lower your hands. All those opposed, raise your hand on the computer. Everyone lower your hands. Abstentions? Seeing none, the motion will actually, motion fails 5-13. So, oh, you abstained. And with one abstention, 5-13-1.
We think the 13 might have been 12. I'm not sure.
Jim Gilmore put his hand up late.
Yeah, so in hopes of moving together with this failure from the council, we don't necessarily need to take a vote at policy board. So we'll move to the main motion then, and we'll call the vote for the commission first. So I'll look to the policy board. As I see hands raised, I will call out the states and hope that staff and my fellows here at the head of the table will help me make sure that I have all the votes covered. Greg, I believe your hand is still up, and I see a hand from Erica Burgess. Erica, did you want to make a comment before we move to the main motion?
Yes, I would. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was wondering, for the benefit of those who are participating virtually, when we do votes, could we announce who's voting or do a roll call vote?
Yes, we could do that. So well, actually, let me ask just one more time on behalf of the commission, are there any hands in need to caucus? We've had fairly lengthy discussions, but I do see a hand, so I'll give everyone 2 minutes. All right, I'm going to call us back to order. I'm going to ask for hands from the policy board on the main motion, and I will do this as a roll call vote. All of those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand online. Okay, here we go. I have Massachusetts, North Carolina, New Hampshire, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, Georgia, PRFC, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Garfo, Connecticut, New York, South Carolina. Okay, hands down. Thank you. Opposed? That doesn't scroll here. Okay, sorry. Florida, Rhode Island, and Maine. Are there any null votes? Not seeing any new hands, but our no our no hands did not go down yet. Okay. No nulls, any abstentions? Okay, so we have a roll call vote that ended up at 14 in favor, 3 opposed, no nulls, no abstentions. So the motion passes for the board. I'll pass it over to Wes.
Thank you, Joe. Erica, if you could put your hand down, please.
It's raised because I wanted the opportunity to explain my vote. We didn't go to discussion on this. We just jumped from discussion on the amendment to this one, so I didn't get the opportunity to explain my vote. If you would allow me the opportunity, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, apologies, Erica. At this point in time, where we had discussion and when is kind of a blur to me. So yes, please go ahead.
So I voted in opposition to this motion because it included moving to option D in the future. Overall, Florida is in opposition to using and presuming that dead discards are a point estimate that can be predicted to reduce and set recreational regulations and recreational catch. Further, D complicates this because it presumes to understand how recreational behavior and discards will change in the face of untested and unknown management measures. So for that reason, I voted against this motion. Thank you.
Now for the council voting on the main motion. All those in favor, please raise your hand on the computer. Just added. All right, I have 15 in favor. Everyone, please put their hands down. All those opposed, raise your hands, please. On the computer. I see 2. Everyone lower your hands. Any abstentions? Seeing none, motion passes 15-2 with no abstentions. Julia, do you have anything else?
We need motions from the policy board to approve the addendum. I think we might need to make sure the language is quite right. And then the council needs to move to submit the framework with preferred alternatives to NIMS. So we do have those ready to go. If you give me a second, as modified today, is that what you're actually?
We might need an implementation date.
Okay. So staff are just clarifying if the implementation date needs to be worked into here. So this would be the policy board motion. And then we have the, okay, so getting confirmation that this motion should be good if someone from the policy board wants to make this motion. And then we have another motion that would be for the council only for submitting the council framework.
Thank you. Can I show a hand for, a hand for a motion to approve this? Joe Grist, thank you. Second, John Clark. Thank you. So I feel like we've had lengthy discussions here. Is there any further discussion on this? Not seeing any. So I'll ask the question, is there any opposition from the board to this motion? Okay, fair enough. Not seeing any. This is approved by consent. Thank you.
Now to the council side, would anyone like to make this motion on behalf of the council? Sonny Gwynn, seconded by Joe Grist. All right, the motion reads, move to submit the recreational measure setting process framework with preferred alternatives as identified to date, National Marine Fisheries Service. I think we've all had a pretty long discussion morning already. Let's see if we can do this easy. Is there any opposition to the motion? Seeing none. Any abstentions to the motion? With one abstention, Garfo. Motion passes by consent. Bob Beal.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick process comment for the commission. The commission usually, when they approve an addendum or an amendment, establishes an effective date. But since this document really doesn't require any of the member states to immediately or eventually implement management measures, it essentially sets up a process for 26 and beyond that I think it's essentially the based on the action taken now, it is in effect, and that is our process moving forward. We don't need to set a compliance date for the states. But so I just want to get that on the record why we didn't include an implementation date in the policy board motion a minute ago.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I think, the management of these species has been unique, and part of that is the rec setting measures and how they differ from some of our other commission moves. Thank you.
All right, with that, Chelsea, Tracy, or Julia, do you have anything else? All right, with that, take our lunch break. Let's go till 1:30, and then we'll continue on with the policy board. Thank you.